Instead of continuously emphasizing the need to let some people get rich first, today the priority is to achieve common prosperity. So equality becomes a big priority today. And that's what they're focusing on. And the government is also trying very hard to root out corruption from the government organization, from the society. So what we should look at this is the Chinese economic system is a dynamic process. What used to work 40 years ago might no longer work, might no longer be the priority today. Eventually, I think this is my personal view, we want to move toward a more democratic political system. We want to move toward a more free market system. That's the destination. And this was why I said I'm not completely rejecting the Washington consensus view. Some of the principles are still useful, but it's just not practical if you start applying it from day one. That's a very important point. Finally, the question about the dominance, AI dominance. Vice President Vance's point, and we all saw that. My sense is that AI, US and China are the two front runners of the AI technological revolution. There are some areas we do very well, but my overall judgment at this stage is that we are still probably behind the US in original research, invention, and so on. But we are catching up very quickly in some areas. You heard about the deep sea. But in many other areas, China is catching up very quickly. And I can tell you, even in the US, a lot of AI scientists were originally from China, trained by our universities. They finished a bachelor's degree and went to the US, get higher education, postgraduate training, and work in the US companies and so on. So this is the very already interlocked, the interconnected system. But the point to me, I don't think we immediately want to displace the US from #1 seat of technological innovation, including AI. For us at this stage, we're still a developing country. And our GDP per capita is still only a bit over $13,000 US. I think we can take time gradually catch up. But the most important point I highlight, which is important for China, and I hope it's also important for you, is that if we can apply the technology already invented by the most advanced country to benefit our economy, that is the most important. For South Africa, for some other developing countries, there might be a concern. If AI replaces labor, is that something you want to do? And I think we need to be careful. I still think employment, the job creation is very important. But even with that, AI can do lots of things to help you. For instance, the mobile payment, I'm sure you already have some of it. Connecting the rural people to the large market. If they were, for instance, producing mangoes before, originally they could only supply to the local market. But my research found a woman living in the village in remote China. Once she started to use mobile payment, her job opportunities, her businesses, her income start to change. The main change is because from then on, this lady living in remote village became connected to the big market outside, and she could supply her products to the national market, and that becomes a big change. So I think AI technology there are lots of AI technology, and you can make lots of uses. But even if you don't want to replace workers labor at the moment, there's still lots of things through connectivity, through supporting inclusion and so on. So I actually think we should work at these, on these. And developing countries should work together, because whatever it works in other developing countries might be beneficial here. And the entry barrier is not too high.
All right. So, a few years ago, I was introduced to a book called The Mandarins by Simone de Beauvoir. Went to a book. It's a kind of fiction, but it's not fiction. Now, Simone de Beauvoir writes after the end of the Second World War in Europe. She was moving in cycles of people who were philosophers and development thinkers in post-war Europe at the time. And so she writes this book called The Mandarin, and I'll talk about why she called it that later on. But in her observation of what was going on with the reconstruction of Europe post the war, was that the people who were at the forefront, even of creating what today is known to be the European Union and all its institutions, were public servants. It was people like Monet and others. They were public servants, they were not elected officials. So the account from that and several other accounts is that Europe was able to rebuild. Of course, there was political support from the official, from politicians, but in the main, it was because of the thinking and the efforts of the public servants in Europe at the time, in particular those who were interacting between, the French, the Germans, the English and others. But as you will know, that the bigger frontier for settling the disputes and for lasting peace was what was going to happen between France and Germany. And they would then go on to set up many institutions that were trying to make sure that even as Germany at the time was seen to be the perpetrator, that the biggest concern, and that's what the public servants were advising, was that if you leave Germany behind, there will be another war. And so they then gave this fearless and advice to the politicians about how to build these institutions, and that in rebuilding Europe, that Germany should not be left behind. Some decades later, you then see the dividend because Germany was able to build and rebuild and very fast to be the dynamic economy that it is, in spite of the losses it suffers during the war. Of course, the late Professor Mkandawiri has got a theory about it, about Germany and Japan as to why they were able to rebuild after the war. And part of his argument is that the Germans and the Japanese were humiliated sufficiently by the losses in the war that there was a national mood amongst officials, politicians, and citizens in general that they must never be humiliated again. In the Chinese context, they said, you'll never kowtow again. And that's what Mkanda will explain. Now, I'm telling this story of this book called The Mandarins. It's a thick book, but it's very interesting, or you can read the memoirs of Monet, because as we are here, you've got the Mandarins, which in this context we cannot the language they speak, but I'm talking about the senior civil servants who ought to be the advanced detachment in the system that provides fearless advice to politicians, to authorities, but that this advice ought to be evidence driven, that it must be rigorous, it must be based on learning, and as we have learned, it must also be based on experimentation, trial and error, feeling the river, as the stones as you cross the river, as it were. Which is the reason why we brought yourselves, colleagues, here to open the frontiers, because in the work that you do every day in ministries and here in the presidency, you are expected to advise on policy matters. There are many choices that can be made. And as we bring them, we brought several others from different countries before. We hope that this will open vistas then of your own understanding of how to sharpen development frontiers and make appropriate choices. Now there is a proposal here of this idea of the global South consensus. I think there will be some kind of what I will call preconditions, and I will not go too much into motivating for why. But as we all know that sometimes there is the anxiety around where ideas come from, what is the intention, and so on. And those anxieties can be managed quite easily, in my view. That if we emerge with a global South consensus, which is a development-oriented consensus in its form and content, we must then agree that the consensus must be characterized by mutual learning, which means we are not imposing, because that's what was the problem with the Washington consensus, that in many instances, because of how IMF and others used it, there was a kind of a sense of imposition. Secondly, it must be characterized by mutual cooperation, so that there's a win-win spirit within it. It must be characterized by fair and equitable trade upfront. Then you are able to manage the anxieties of the smaller nations who are trying to crack into the global trading system, because the ladder has been kicked for them by the global north, and more so recently with the hyper tariff arrangement that we are in. And fourthly, that it must be characterized by the willingness to have very visible technology transfer, because there are countries who are far ahead on the frontier of technological development. And then lastly, that this frontier, as a counter to the Washington consensus, must be characterized by what I call developmental statecraft, which means those amongst us as countries who have certain capabilities will use those capabilities to support others to grow and advance, which is an opposite of what I call hegemonic statecraft, where you use the power that you have to bully others. As South Africa right now, we are experiencing hegemonic statecraft in a manner in which Washington has taken a posture against South Africa, using all matrices of power, from tariffs and now sanctions and all other means at their disposal to subjugate or to bring us to line, as it were. And in fact, they are very bold, even in their own parliament, to say they are opposed to national transformation policies of a sovereign state. And that is what I call abuse of statecraft, which uses hegemony as opposed to being developmental, as you use all the resources you have as a state to ensure that there is advancement of others. And then lastly, for this to work, and more so because we are talking about China and we are talking in context here, because those who will be threatened by the Global South consensus will raise certain issues. They will make reference to the type of relationship that China will have had with Africa, Latin America, and so on. Perhaps what can give the Global South a fighting chance is an agreement of what I call the Kimberley 2 process. That Kimberley 2 process must be at the center of the Global South consensus. Now, Kimberley Process 1 was a process that was initiated by the global community because it had to counter the blood diamonds. There were many people who were dying in Liberia and elsewhere because of how the diamond trade was going on. A Kimberley 2 process, therefore, in the context of the critical minerals, in my view, will mean we agree that the Global South will open production and trade frontiers by using their comparative advantage to industrialize, which means using the critical minerals. That then changes the conversation, because it means if Zambia or if South Africa has got certain critical minerals, it means our comparative advantage is owning them. And by owning them, we will enter the production frontier and a trade frontier resulting in some structural transformation by adding some value into those minerals before they leave those countries. That kind of a Kimberley process will give very small nations a fighting chance to industrialize, because all they have is what is beneath the ground. And if we agree, therefore, that just as we said with the Kimberley process, one, that we will eliminate blood diamonds, we will make sure that there is transparent trade, of diamond. We could then have a Kimberley 2 process that uses the principles of the first, but to give a fighting chance to countries of the Global South by saying no minerals will leave those countries before there is some value addition into those. This then becomes the most decisive global South consensus, which is a counter, something that even if we tried the Washington consensus for 200 years, will never have occurred, because just as we were still dealing and grappling with the issue of our comparative advantage, we were then immediately told that we must shift towards dealing with competitive advantage. How do we build competitive advantages in the global trading system that we have in countries where people are still stuck because of colonial as well as other legacies? Is it possible? Is it sustainable? I think there are some breakthroughs that have been made. If the Global South consensus is built on the breakthroughs of BRICS, in spite of all, and I've made this argument public several times, in spite of the contradictions among some members of BRICS, BRICS has survived for over 15 years. And in BRICS, there are sharp contradictions. There are contradictions between India and China. There are contradictions between even us and Brazil. Brazil is protecting the Mercosur market. We can't export our wines to Brazil, but we understand because they've got Chile and Argentina and others who need to sell their wine there. And in BRICS, we've got many countries where the heads of states have changed, but BRICS remain. And they've been able to put together a viable institution like the BRICS Bank, and my challenge is they need to bring a lot more institutions. So if you use BRICS, for example, as an experiment, as an experience of building some kind of consensus, and importantly, it's not a military alliance, which is what the Washington consensus eventually became, because parallel to it was NATO. Then there is a lesson there. Then factor in GCC, which is in the Middle East, the Gulf Cooperation States, and their contribution in this regard. And we saw them there in BRICS, they are beginning to be active. And so there are possibilities of aligning with the Middle East if you bring what is common with what is emerging in the GCC. And of course, ASEAN as well, because there are some foundations that have been built there. So if people say, is it possible to do it? I think if you were to use what is emerging out of these bodies, including Mercosur actually in Latin America, I think the foundation is there. However, there has to be some kind of an understanding that we need to give many countries of the Global South a fighting chance to industrialize. And at the moment, the only way they can industrialize is to use their comparative advantage, and their comparative advantage for many of them will be their natural resources. And which means we must reverse then the trend of how the natural resources are exploited and use that as a basis for industrialization. Finally, what I've learned from comparing what's going on across countries, and it's linked to the question I will ask you as part of you summarizing and closing, is what will this thing take? I mean, what does it take for countries now to succeed? Of course, you colleagues know there's a video I've circulated among many of you where Kishore makes an argument that China succeeds because of government and India succeeds in spite of government, and there's a lot of nuance around it. And I've asked a question about South Africa. What I've seen work, especially as part of the China story, is in no particular order. Number one, that policies must be prioritized. That we have to prioritize policy. We came in South Africa at some point a number of years ago, 15 or so years ago, we had 60 priorities. Yeah, we had 60 priorities, and we also had a wall-to-wall, country-to-country approach to national development. That is why in South Africa today, we decided to declare special economic zones in every province. Even scientifically and objectively, knowing full well that some of them will never work, not in the next 15 years. Yeah. Unless there is this miracle in FDI, fixed investment. And right now, there is no fighting chance. We will debate this tomorrow at the Department of Trade and Industry, because the problem is how we prioritize. Because we democratized these things by thinking if we have a special economic zone everywhere, we are democratizing industrial policy, you make everybody happy, yet you take away the fighting chance because we are not concentrating resources. So prioritization is the first thing, and it is emerging. The second one is around sequencing. What comes first? What must be done first? And in the majority of cases in the Global South, we have tended to want to do 10 things at the same time because we are chasing political imperatives and so on. And it then thins institutions and the resources that could be utilized effectively. Thirdly, is this idea of allowing for experimentation, that we must allow colleagues, to experiment policy and also to make the necessary changes in our South African context, because everything we do, the zeitgeist is how we are spending, and the author general, there is a fear and there's a culture of wanting to punish experimentation, and the failure is you load it because you'll be punished as opposed to learning from it. And the fourthly is to allow for reform and realignment of institutions to be responsive and resilient. Because where we are at today, if we read Vivek Chiba, he wrote this about 25 years ago about India, when he's comparing why India remained behind when the whole of Asia was moving ahead. His characterization is that Indian institutions were locked in place. So they were not reforming, they were stuck, as is the case with many of the South African institutions. So there was no reform. Whereas in the case of China, we see this constant idea of reforming institutions, especially local government and SOEs. And in the book by Kapoor and others, their argument is that the Indian state is only able now to begin to increase their industrialization potential by reforming local government. In the South African context, we didn't talk about it. The local government institution is locked in place.
Yeah.
And that is the one that's supposed to be driving growth. And so if there was any decisive intervention to reform institutions besides the SOEs, one of them will have to be the local government institution. As you know, whereas the Chinese SOEs contribute over 20% to GDP and employment, South African SOEs contribute 80% towards contingent liabilities. So it is a complete opposite, and they are a drag on the system. So thank you, colleagues, for coming, and thank you for sharing. We will do a lot more of this into the future, although I'll be wearing a different cap, but we will still sustain this conversation. My last question to you, if you can answer and round up and recruit the students, is a question that people ask: why are Chinese public servants efficient, right? And what do you teach at ISCAT? Because you were given a mandate by the president of China to train students from the global south, so that they can go back and support national development efforts. So what is it that makes them effective and efficient? Maybe it's about their training and education. I ask this because you have a National School of Development, we have a National School of Government. We must orientate how we train and reskill our own public servants so that they can have produce the kind of development outcomes that you have. So if you could talk about it, how you train them, how you prepare. Of course, there's a show and tell. Some are here. And finally, next steps, as Edward is here to recruit.
That's right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you.
Hosseini. I just want to conclude. First of all, I really appreciate you taking time to come to today's event, and I certainly enjoyed and was impressed by all the questions you raised. The idea of a global South consensus, is an academic initiative, as I said, and we hope to discuss with experts from the global southern countries, and hopefully we'll reach some useful agreement. But this is an ongoing process, and I think, like Professor Hosseini said, if it's called the Global South Consensus, then it probably should not be tied to specific countries. But it's just because some of the Asian countries, including China, were successful, it makes an important reference. And partly also because I'm more familiar with the Chinese case. But I'm hoping this Global South Consensus belongs to Global South, not necessarily some specific person. So I'm very open to discuss about what is appropriate for developing countries here. To answer the question Professor Bosani just asked, what do we teach at the ISCAT? Mainly two things. Number one is we try to teach, obviously, modern theory about economic development. But we're also trying to teach modern economics that is, we think, is appropriate for the developing countries. For instance, our founding dean, Professor Justin Lin, he just created this new branch of economics called the New Structure Economics. And as I mentioned earlier on, he believes that economic growth or development should be a series of structure upgrading. You're moving from low-end manufacturing to high-end manufacturing, from agriculture to manufacturing to service sector and so on. So he spent his lifetime studying what can we do to promote this structural evolution. And that, I think, his theory actually answers some of your questions earlier. If South Africa want to move up the industrial ladder, what should the government do? What should we do to the market? That's one part of the story we have. The second thing we also teach quite a lot is that we take students around the country to see where big changes happen. And that actually is very useful, and some of our students can tell you later on. They went to like the big cities which used to be small fishing towns. And within a couple of decades, they became like very modern cities. How did that change happen? And that was very impactful. Some of them also went to the villages, started agricultural reforms. The villagers never had enough food to eat, never produced enough food to eat. But once there was a big institutional change, they had more than enough food produced. That kind of like a magical change was very useful for the students to take away. We are not trying to tell the students that you go back to implement what the Chinese policy, but we are telling them there is alternative economic theory that is useful, and you look at what China did with that, equipped with that two types of knowledge. You go back to your country, and hopefully you can create or put together some policy framework according to the conditions in your own country. That's what our purpose is. So our purpose is to train lots of developing country leaders that they can also go back to help change their own economy. That's the main purpose. A small question relates to earlier on. You said that the Chinese officials are all very effective and work very hard to deliver.
Generally speaking.
Generally speaking, true, which is true. We had a specific, this is related to pragmatism. One very important policy in the early stage of the reform was decentralization. The decision power decentralized from the center to local level. And the local government officials then had a lot more incentives, and they can make a decision according to the local conditions. That is useful, but that's not enough. It's also very important, because that what I just said was the feasibility criteria. What is also important on the second term is you look at the result. Local official performance were evaluated according to GDP growth in their region. In fact, there were academic studies showing that the officials, senior officials of a region, got a better chance of being promoted if their economic development performance was better. Now, that is changing now, gradually changing now, because as I said, growth is not everything. But I'm sure you would agree at the beginning of the reform, growth was everything. Because growth brings higher income, brings more jobs, brings better life. But today, we need to pay attention to growth. Growth is still very important. But the environment, employment, and the living standard, so it becomes much more complicated. But I think what is important is You give them the freedom, the room to make decisions, but you tell them what is the benchmark. In the end, we'll evaluate you. That, I think, worked